Before this rock we're all floating on in the middle of space knew the feeling of feet on its surface. Before Paul was blinded on the road to Damascus. Before divided tongues of fire lit up a room and the eyes of everyone watching. Before David plucked a harp or reached his hand into the cool water of the brook to select 5 smooth stones. Before animals had names or the first pair of lungs drew breath. The earth knew only one thing: darkness. Which isn't even a thing. It's a state of being. It is made of nothing. It has no scientific definition other than the absence of visibility. It's a void. Something you can feel but not touch. Something you can sense but not see. In the beginning, darkness was over the face of the deep. A blank canvas onto which God could paint whatever he wanted. He could have made anything, created anything, spoke anything into being. And he chose to begin with light, which got things off to a good start. He even said so himself. The world was a primeval, disordered chaos. So he fixed the place up and organized it into dry land, sea, sky, gave it some shape. He added vegetation, which turned the surface into a kaleidoscope of color. He added more than 9 million species of animals to populate and add dramatic movement to this growing masterpiece, each one more fabulous and spectacular to look at than the next. And he called them all good. But it still wasn't enough. God wanted to make something that looked like him. Let us make man in our own image, after our likeness. And so up we came, from the dust of the earth, formed out of clay or a rib, each of us containing 45 miles of nerves that enable us to experience the sensation of touch, a mind to think, a tongue to taste all the goodness that had just been made, ears to hear, and most of all, eyes to see. Mineralogists who study the world's rarest gems have never been able to identify anything more astoundingly mysterious or indescribably beautiful than the human eye. If you peer deep into irises, they seem to contain whole galaxies, nebulae, and interstellar clouds, expanding and contracting with the dilation of the pupils. They can also get us into trouble, which they did. The forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not only said to be good for food, but also pleasing to the eye. It was attractive, and so we took it. And then everything blew up, which is what tends to happen when we take something attractive we were told not to take. And soon we found ourselves naked and alone, separated from God, and locked out of paradise, the first of many exiles to come. What would happen next? What would we find in that howling wilderness east of Eden? For being called the tree of knowledge, it certainly didn't live up to its name. We gained no new knowledge except the fact that we were lost. In the aftermath, when God cursed the deceiver, he alluded to an offspring born of a woman who would crush the serpent and set things to right. But when? How soon? Who would this saving person born of woman be? And how would he redeem the broken world? We would have to wait and see.
Things went downhill pretty fast. Abel's blood cried out from the ground, and when God asked Cain about it, he replied, "Am I my brother's keeper? Every man for himself, every woman for herself. Self, self, self." And soon the storm clouds gathered, swollen with rain. Had the human experiment been a mistake? Maybe a reset would do. Noah's hands stripped bark from gopher wood to build an ark quickly filled with twosomes of fur, wool, scales, feathers, hooves, talons, claws, teeth, and horns. How's that sound for company on a 40-day sail on rough seas? The earth was baptized by water, cleansed and rinsed. Noah's trembling ancient hands carried a squirming dove, cooing and agitated to the ship's edge, sent her fluttering into the wind to look for signs of hope. She returned with an olive leaf, evermore to be a symbol of peace, renewal, and new beginnings, if only it had lasted. We got it in our heads to burn bricks and build a tower to make a name for ourselves, to declare our empowered independence, a ziggurat of stone, bitumen, and mortar, all chalky and sticky and hard like our hearts. Of course, that didn't work. And as a result, suddenly we couldn't understand each other, couldn't communicate. It sharpened our divisions and left us scattered, hunkered down, and resentful. But God didn't give up on his children. There was one man, Abram, who lived in a place called Ur, a word that sounds like hesitation, which is too bad because the first thing God told him to do was leave, abandon his father's house, and go someplace not specified, just a land that I will show you. To leave Ur of the Chaldeans was a step of great faith, one that God rewarded by giving Abram a series of promises and covenants, and changed his name to Abraham. Seems like God changes people's names a lot, but it's never really about the name itself. It's about transformation. He loves flipping people, the way you might flip a house. He loves giving people a spiritual makeover, a fresh start. That didn't mean it was easy. Coarse rope, rug burned little Isaac's bound hands as Abraham laid the cold blade to his neck before an angel cried out at the last second, and a ram was provided instead. We should have seen it coming all along. Salvation at the 11th hour. An alternate sacrifice offered on our behalf. An undeserved emergency exit. Redemption against all odds. Not that we noticed. We still tried to do things our own way. Jacob wrapped his arms in the shaggy fuzz of goatskins to deceive Isaac and lay hold of his birthright, tooth and nail. He ended up laying hold of himself, in the sweat-slick strain of wrist locks and half-Nelsons, and the blinding pain of a hip joint popped out of socket when he wrestled with God, demanded a blessing, and received a new name, Israel. From then on, the name used to describe the people who follow God. He limped for the rest of his life and had 12 sons who would become 12 tribes through whom it was said the earth would be blessed. But not before those 12 tribes were enslaved by Egypt in a cruel nightmare that involved infant boys being drowned in the Nile because Pharaoh felt threatened and insecure. Wouldn't be the last time a tyrant ordered the genocide of infant boys. But there was one woman who hid her son from the terror. And when she could hide him no longer, placed him in a basket made of bulrushes, daubed with pitch, set him afloat among the reeds of the Nile. The act itself a watery, whispered prayer for someone to deliver God's people from bondage. Enslaved, burdened, and full of despair, we waited.
What happened next is a story oft-repeated and repeatedly forgotten. A burning bush, a stick turned to a snake, a leprous hand, a lot of back and forth, and 10 plagues later, Israel finally tasted freedom when Moses led them out of Egypt. Years after, some would say they could still smell the salt mist swirling violently up from the parted Red Sea. Could still see Miriam leading the women in a dance with their timbrels after the waters closed in on the chariots. Could still taste the provision of manna and quail in the wilderness. But the memories faded, and we soon forgot all that God had done. We lost faith, lost direction, and wandered around complaining for years. To get us back on track, God gave 613 commandments, the law, a cartography for how to move safely and healthily through a savage and sick world, a guidebook for worship and holidays, all of which were kind of a sensory overload. Incense in the tabernacle, the smoke of burnt offerings on the altar, the blasting of trumpets, the eating of bitter herbs in the Passover feast. After many wars and heartaches and miracles, God's people at last made their home in a land flowing with milk and honey. A boy who spent his days in the field with sheep played the harp before a brooding king. He later exchanged the peat animal stink in his hair for the cinnamon and cassia aromas of the holy anointing oil poured over his head when he himself became king. It was later foretold that a very special king would come from the line of David who would save us from our oppressors, once and for all. People took this very literally, which led to a lot of confusion, and in general, having earthly kings was a headache that ended in disaster. Remember those inimitable luminous eyes we talked about at the beginning? The ones that can wander? They did. Under a series of bad kings, they drifted to and worshipped false gods of the surrounding nations, Baal, Ashtoreth, Dagon, Marduk. They tempt us still to this day, we just call them by different names. This led to a new kind of sensory overload, the cup of staggering, the stench of death and the massacre of Jerusalem, smoke rising from the ashes of Solomon's temple destroyed, the wailing of God's people as the Babylonians carried us into exile, cut off from our land of promise. On the banks of the Euphrates River, we were so homesick that not even singing songs from the old country could lift up our spirits anymore. So we hung up our instruments in the willow trees, heaped ashes on our heads, and wept. Our captors wanted to torment us, so they taunted, their acidic hot breath like toxic vapor demanding in our ears, "Show a little mirth. Come on, sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Our mouths went dry, our souls went dry. Where was he? This supposed conquering king from the line of David. How long would he hide his face? This rod of Jesse, this key of David. Who would pay our ransom?
I wish you could have heard it. The shouts of jubilation and singing through tears of joy when the people came home from exile. Deliverance had come by unusual means. The Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, defeated Babylon and let God's children go back to their country, rebuild their temple, restore their way of life, and try to put things back together. Remember those 613 laws we talked about earlier? Determined not to let what had just happened happen again, some people became obsessed with the commandments, observing them more strictly, even adding to them, heaping up new rules and requirements too burdensome for anyone to bear, and imposing them on others. Some became ostentatious in our appointed feasts and showy displays of vain offerings and over-the-top convocations. Even God himself grew weary of the whole charade, wishing only for the fidelity of our hearts, not our expensive performances of worship. We were missing the point. Again. Others became complacent and fell back into our old ways. Amid all of it, barefoot and wild-haired, the prophets stood in the highways and byways, raising the alarm, channeling God's wrath, his heartache, his desperate prodigal love, longing for us to return to him with right hearts and pure spirits. The prophets begged and screamed. They tried to make us listen. But by the time Alexander the Great conquered Persia and then captured Jerusalem, their vocal cords had gone hoarse in futility. They faded into 400 years of silence. Silence, like darkness, is an abstraction. It's invisible, untouchable, and when it's coming from God, unbearable. There's a kind of violence in it, a soundless slam door that suggests abandonment. Deus absconditus. Rulers, they came and went. The Seleucids, the Hashmoneans, finally Rome with her onerous taxation and violent contempt. And still, none of it was worse than the silence of God. Until one cold night in the city of David, all of that crushing absence of a divine voice, all of that bottomless spiritual darkness that enveloped the world was shattered by the cry of a baby. A song in the heavens sung to blue-collar third-shift workers in the night, and later their own voices proclaiming the news to anyone who would listen. Hope was finally here. The curtain of the temple had not yet torn in two, but something else was ruptured. Something imperceptible yet momentous was punched through with light and possibilities previously unthinkable. I really wish that you could have heard it. Oh wait, actually, you can. The piercing rapture of that baby's voice cutting through air thick with the smell of straw and barn animals and blood proclaims itself ceaselessly to the world over, inviting you to step through that door first opened by that tiny gasp of breath. It's everywhere. It's everywhere and it's all around you, forever expanding and amplifying the songs of the angels whose simple message was, don't be afraid. We have good news. It's about great joy. And it's for all people. It's for you. And everyone you know and everyone you don't know. It's for anyone who's ever been or whoever will be. It's about a savior in the form of the most vulnerable thing on earth. A newborn infant in the place you'd least expect to find him. Hey, whoever you are, whether you know it or not, he's the one you've been waiting for.
Hey, it's Dallas, the creator of The Chosen. Thank you so much for checking out our video. I'm actually standing on the set of season 2 of The Chosen right now. Got a quick favor to ask of you. In exchange for all of the free content we're giving out on our channel and on the app, and all of season 1 is totally free, if you wouldn't mind clicking the subscribe or the notification bell, checking out the links in our description, it would really mean a lot. It actually helps the show and our channel get out in front of more people. Thank you so much.